What if I told you that two guys figured out the basic structure of the universe, 2,400 years before we had microscopes, particle accelerators, or even decent plumbing? We're talking about ancient Greece, the 5th century BCE, a time when the cutting edge of technology was like a really good sandal. And yet, in this world of togas and olive oil, two philosophers named Leucippus and his student Democritus sat down and said, "You know what? Everything in the universe is made of tiny, invisible, indestructible particles moving around in empty space." They called these particles atomos, Greek for uncuttable. And here's the wild part. They were basically right. No experiments, no laboratories, no billion-dollar research grants. Just two dudes thinking really, really hard. So today we're going to talk about how the ancient Greeks accidentally invented atomic theory, why nobody believed them for over 2,000 years, and what their ideas can teach us about how we understand reality. Let's get into it. Okay, so to understand why this was such a big deal, we need to talk about the philosophical drama happening in ancient Greece at the time. Because philosophers back then, they had beef. See, there was this other philosopher named Parmenides. And Parmenides had a hot take that honestly sounds like something you'd say at 2 a.m. after one too many drinks. He said, "Change is an illusion. Motion is impossible. Everything that exists is actually just one thing, and it never changes." Now, you might be thinking, Parmenides, buddy, I literally just watched a grape roll off my table. Things move. But Parmenides had a clever argument. He said, for something to move, it would need empty space to move into. But empty space is nothing, and nothing can't exist. Therefore, motion is impossible. It's the kind of argument that's technically logical but also makes you want to throw something at him, which you can't do, because motion is impossible, apparently. So along come Leucippus and Democritus, and they basically said, okay, cool argument, but we're going to flip it. Their response was essentially, motion obviously exists. I can see things moving right now. So if motion requires empty space, then empty space must exist. Checkmate. They called this empty space the void. And it's not just empty space like your living room when nobody's home. It's a complete, total absence of matter, a vacuum. And floating around in this void, atoms. Tiny, invisible, eternal particles that make up literally everything. Now let's talk about what Democritus actually thought atoms were like, because he had some surprisingly detailed ideas for a guy working without a microscope. First, atoms are indestructible. You can take a tree, chop it into logs, break those into splinters, grind those into sawdust, but eventually you hit a level where you can't divide anymore. That's the atom, the smallest possible unit of stuff. Second, atoms are eternal. They don't get created, they don't get destroyed, they just exist, bouncing around the void forever. Third, and this is where it gets fun, atoms come in different shapes and sizes. Democritus suggested that the properties of different substances depend on what kind of atoms they're made of. For example, water atoms are smooth and round. That's why water flows. The atoms just slide past each other like tiny ball bearings. Air atoms are light and wispy, which is why air is, well, airy. They float around independently, not really sticking to anything. Iron atoms have little hooks on them. That's why iron is solid. The atoms literally hook together and hold on tight. And my personal favorite, salt atoms are jagged. That's why salt tastes sharp. The little pointy atoms are poking your tongue. Now, is any of this scientifically accurate? Not really. Modern chemistry is way more complicated. But the core idea, that different substances have different properties because of the structure of their smallest parts, that's actually not far off. Okay, here's where Democritus gets a little weird, but stick with me because it's actually kind of brilliant. He asked the question, how do we see things? His answer, objects constantly emit tiny copies of themselves, little particle films that fly through the air and hit your eyeballs. He called these idols, not like pop star idols, more like tiny ghost copies of everything. So when you look at, say, a cup, the cup is shooting out these microscopic cup-shaped particle sheets, and they travel through the air, hit your eyes, and create the sensation of seeing a cup. It sounds completely ridiculous, right? Like, is my coffee mug just constantly shedding tiny mug ghosts at me? But here's the thing. He was trying to explain something that's actually really hard to explain. How does information from the outside world get into our brains? Modern science says it's through photons, light particles bouncing off objects and hitting our retinas, which is honestly not that different from Democritus's idol theory. He just didn't have the right particles. And it gets deeper. Democritus said that once these idols hit your sense organs, they make impressions on the atoms in your eyes, ears, tongue, whatever. And then those impressions travel to your soul. Oh yeah, the soul. Democritus thought the soul was made of fire atoms, the lightest, most mobile atoms, capable of interpreting all the sensory data and turning it into conscious experience. So even consciousness, for Democritus, was just atoms, specifically really fast atoms that are good at their job. So here's the tragedy of this story. Leucippus and Democritus came up with this genuinely revolutionary theory, and almost nobody cared. Why? A few reasons. First, they couldn't prove any of it. Atoms are way too small to see. So when they said everything is made of invisible particles, people were like, cool story, bro, show me. Second, competing philosophies were more popular. Plato and Aristotle came along and said, actually, the world is made of 4 elements: earth, water, air, and fire. Which sounds way more poetic and intuitive. You can actually see fire. Nobody's ever seen an atom hook. Aristotle in particular hated the idea of the void. He thought nature abhors a vacuum, and that empty space was philosophically impossible. And since Aristotle was basically the Beyoncé of ancient philosophy, people listened to him for about 2,000 years. It wasn't until the 1800s, over 2 millennia later, that scientists like John Dalton started reviving atomic theory based on actual experiments. And even then, it took until the early 1900s for atoms to be definitively proven. So Democritus was right. He just had to wait 2,400 years to get credit for it. So what can we learn from all this? I think there are 2 big takeaways. First, sometimes the right answer comes way before we're ready to accept it. Democritus didn't have the tools to prove his theory. He just reasoned his way there. And that's kind of incredible. It shows that logic and careful thinking can get you surprisingly far, even without fancy technology. Second, ideas don't exist in a vacuum. Well, okay, atoms do, according to Democritus. But ideas need the right cultural moment to take hold. Atomic theory was too weird, too unprovable, and too at odds with popular philosophy to succeed in ancient Greece. It needed modern science to finally get its day. And honestly, there's something weirdly inspiring about that. Maybe there's someone out there right now proposing some wild theory that sounds completely ridiculous. But in 2,000 years, everyone will be like, oh yeah, they figured that out ages ago. So next time you have a crazy idea, remember Democritus. He thought everything was made of tiny particles with hooks, and he was basically right. Subscribe for more interesting philosophical stories. Thank you.